Short questions, short answers by Torah teacher Ariel and eBible. Copyright TaNaKH Ministries 2015. All rights reserved. Here's the question for tonight. Why is salvation by works a commonly held viewpoint by non-believers and some believers as well? I cannot speak for non-believing Gentiles, since there are a plethora of false religions and ideologies in the world that touch on this question for unsaved Gentiles. Given my personal knowledge of Judaism, however, I would like to speak briefly about unsaved Jewish views of salvation by works. What exactly does this mean for Jewish people? How do they view salvation? For my explanation, I need to divide the unsaved Jewish people into two types. Number one, we've got historic Jews, which are those who lived from the birth of National Israel, basically the book of Exodus, up to the 1st century. And then two, we've got traditional Jews, that is those living after the destruction of the Second Temple in 70 AD. Until today, historic Jews, it is somewhat difficult to ascertain precisely what unsaved Jewish people of the period of the TaNaKH held to for personal salvation, but we could be fairly certain it was not mere works, viz. Commandment keeping or bringing sacrifices. In truth, salvation most definitely involved those aspects, but it was not rooted in these aspects. So I don't believe they held to a basic merit theology based on the information that we have available to us. If the surviving Jewish works such as the Talmuds, the midrashim, the Dead Sea Scrolls, etc., have anything to contribute to the discussion, it would be that salvation was believed to be extended by God via one's heritage in Israel as a Jew. And we can see this in the way many Jews of the Gospels demonstrated loyalty to what was called the merit of the fathers, the avot, right? Matthew 3:9 and Luke 3:8 and John 8:39, right? The merits of the fathers applied to the children. That's somewhat what I call kind of a heritage salvation view that we can read about in the Gospels. In this view, a quote, good standing saved covenant member, end quote, was duty bound to keep Torah and avoid idolatry. That's basically it. Thus, Torah became the maintenance tool used by the community not to save the Jews, but to maintain their place in God's covenant as saved Jews. And we talked about this last week. Essentially, those we identify as unsaved Jews of the 1st century held to what I call a nationalistic salvation, where Jewish lineage guaranteed a good standing Jew a place in the world to come. So again, a place in the world to come is basically heaven, what Christians call. We genuine believers know that this is legalism, i.e. works, but those unsaved Jews didn't term it legalism because they didn't feel they were working to gain it. It wasn't really self-effort. Understand the distinction there. We'll talk a little bit more about that later. In their eyes, Jewish ethnicity in National Israel was an act of grace. It wasn't self-effort. After all, those born with Jewish ethnicity did not work their way into that ethnicity, right? So you can see why they defined it as grace and not works. They didn't really see themselves as working their way into the Olam Haba. Paul often calls this salvation by being Jewish ideology works of the law in Galatians 2:15 and 16. Traditional Jews, what do they think? Since the destruction of the temple, the Pharisaic Judaisms of the 1st century gave rise to rabbinic Judaism and eventually to the traditional Judaisms of the 21st century. So Judaisms of today is a product of the birth of Judaism after the destruction of the temple, rabbinic Judaism. Traditional Jews today understand that without a temple, much of the Torah cannot be kept anymore. To be sure, ritual impurity and sins associated with it cannot be atoned for by the sacrificial system anymore either. Traditional Jews still maintain their belief in Jewish heritage, but the emphasis has evolved from primarily ethnicity to now include what must I do to make the world a better place for me and for everyone involved. That's a primary emphasis of today's rabbinic Judaism. It's a very humanitarian-driven religion that's not focusing so much on ethnicity anymore. Thus, in traditional Judaism, salvation, quote-unquote, is basically defined by these three things. Number one, doing charity. Number two, repenting of sins. And number three, praying the set-time prayer book prayers as dictated by the rabbis. Those are the three ingredients of salvation. As with historic Jews, traditional Jews do not really see these three as, quote, working their way into heaven. right? Rather, they see these three as a replacement for the missing sacrificial system and a way to demonstrate one's Jewish loyalty to the covenant that God made with Israel. Basically, traditional Jews see their salvation as grace, with these three concepts vindicating genuine covenant membership. So, what are our conclusions to tonight's study? Anything that bypasses faith in Yeshua as the only way to be saved is basically a work. Unsaved Jewish people may not define their respective beliefs as salvation by works, but make no mistake, that is what it truly is if they reject Yeshua's gracious offer. Right? We all know that's correct. Check out my podcasts, which are available on iTunes. You can search for me in the store under the search term Ariel HaNavi. But if you prefer to watch your theology, check out my YouTube channel, subscribe to my YouTube channel, and click the bell for notifications. New content is added weekly or even daily.